I recorded it all and I forgot I recorded it in 360p, so I'm I'm going to record it and explain it again. So basically, you've got your nation here, so your country of your choice, obviously, and here you've got your tax rate, which I have set at 25%. You have your daily income, your government's daily income, and your government's daily expenditure. Up here you have your debts. I have 2.4 trillion in debt. I'm paying that back at a 2.131 interest rate. You have your treasury. This is how much money you have available to spend at any given time. And every day that will go up by 7.82 billion, because as you can see, my daily surplus is 7.82 billion. And here you have your foreign investments, so how much you've spent in total on investing in foreign countries. And you can see I've spent about 6.2 trillion in foreign investments. And that gives me a 6% return on investment, so I get 1 billion daily back from that. Your tax income is affected by several things. Your corruption, so if you've got widespread unrestrained corruption, your tax revenue will be minus 20%. I've got negligible corruption, so it's only minus 1%. It's also impacted by the condition of your economy. I'm in an economic boom, so you can see I get tax revenue plus 10%. If you was in a depression, you get tax revenue minus 40%. It's impacted by your GDP per capita. So you can see that, you know, your GDP per capita dictates sort of as well your tax income. And other things as well. There's several other things that increase or decrease tax income. But effectively those are the core things, right? Your construction page is here. Now how many factories you have available is dependent on your tax rate. So I've got a tax rate of 25%, which means usually 25% of my factories would be used off balance. So, you know, what's the vanilla term for that? I'm not sure what the vanilla term, but basically it's consumer cost, right? Consumer cost. So my consumer cost is 25%. So 25% of my factories are unavailable for construction. This is a little bit lower. It's only 13%, and that's because of several things. You know, I've got different modifiers lowering the amount of consumer factories needed, right? So actually, only 13% of my factories are being used. You can, you know, if you want more money, you need to increase taxes, but you also need to be aware that that will slow your growth because obviously you have less factories available to use. But it may actually balance it out as well if you invest in your public services. So if you invest in education, for example, and you say, right, okay, free universal qualification, that will basically, yeah, that will cost me about 7 billion, so that will completely wipe out my surplus. I'll be on a tiny, tiny surplus after that. But I would get plus 4% division organisation, plus 5% construction speed, plus 30% research speed. So if you're research heavy and you really need to catch up, and you're willing to go into debt, maybe that's a good idea. But you've also got healthcare, so monthly population plus 75%, tax cost minus 4%, daily political power gain, you know, 0.25%, or 0.25. Minimal pension, so you can go full extensive welfare state, gives you loads of stability, loads of monthly population, and loads of political power gain. Other than that, of course, you've got influence and foreign investment. So if I wanted to invest in a foreign country, let's say, what foreign country? Let's say the UK. We can see the UK is pretty much a high tax, high welfare society. So they've got they're a welfare state. They've got free emergency treatment, higher education focus, high police and intelligence funding, etc. Right? So they're a high welfare, fairly high tax society. Whereas I'm a low tax, low welfare society, right? So low tax, low welfare. That as a result of that, they run a deficit of about £500 million a day. They have 3 trillion in debt, but their interest rate is fairly low, and that's because, you know, they have a fairly large economy, so they're able to pay it back. They're on stable growth, and their total GDP per capita is £30,000. And you can see at the bottom of research, you can see at the bottom of that description there, it says interest rate 0.8%. So that's the base interest rate. the more your GDP per capita goes up, the lower your base interest rate is. So let's go to me, right? At 7k, I've got a base interest rate of 2%. So actually, if I had a GDP the same as them, my interest rate would be about 0.1%, and I wouldn't have to pay, I could just take on loads of debt and not have to pay it back. If you take on too much debt, your interest rate starts going up, and then eventually you go bankrupt if you take on too much. But essentially, they're a high welfare society, right? So I can say, okay, well, actually, first of all, let me explain influence, right? You've got influences in the UK. The UK has a total independence from foreign influence of 54%. So, their rough independence measurement, if you want to call it that, is 54%. If I say, okay, actually UK, I'm going to buy up loads of railways. I'm going to build loads of railways in the southeast, here, and I'm going to build more infrastructure in London, or I'm going to build civilian factories in the south. Well, I've just paid loads of money to the UK, so now I've just gained 9% influence over the UK, which has reduced their total level of independence to 51 from 54, and that's because I've also snatched some influence from other influencers, right? And as you go up, you can start manipulating their politics. You can attempt a coup. You can exploit them economically, so you can get favorable trade costs and better civilian industry. You can get 20% of their civilian industry. You can turn them into a puppet at 80% influence. But to turn the UK into a puppet, I would probably have to spend billions, and well, I say billion, trillions. I'd probably have to spend trillions, because they're an established country, but also the higher your influence goes up, the harder it is to get it, right? So let's say I got to like 75% influence. I would have to spend so much just to get to 80, whereas, only spending a little bit, I already got 9%, right? So there's a lot of things that go into it and a lot of things that influence it. But effectively, that's one of the big things. So as I say, you've got debt, treasury, foreign investments. Your surplus you can see by hovering over that, or by looking here. Your tax rate you can adjust. Your social policies, these dictate, what sort of benefits your society gets, what sort of benefits you get, but they can be very, very expensive. So I spend a lot on my military, for example. Your corruption rate, this is only reducible via political power or via focus. It costs a lot of political power to do it, as you can see. And changing economic cycles is pretty much impossible via political power. You have to sort of depend on randomized events. So you can change what type of economy you are. Are you a mixed economy? You export half of your resources, or are you an export economy? But it costs more taxes to do that. So if you haven't got many resources, there's no point going export economy, because you're just imposing a tax burden on your society when you're not exporting anything. You really need to be exporting a lot for it to be worth it, at least in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, it's not as good as the other video, but I mean, it explains it fairly well. So the reason I have such high influence over places like Vietnam and I'm not going to pronounce it, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, you can see I have very high influence, and I can start attempting a coup. So let's attempt a coup. Launch coup to put in power the biggest party of our outlook. So it will either go successful, it will either fail, and if it fails, it reduces my influence, or it will start a civil war. So let's give it a go. China under pressure as Malaysia defeat coup, and now you can see my influence has massively decreased, right? That's because they defeated my coup. The RNG defeated me. So there's loads of things that go into it, right? I mean, you can buy up influence, or you can spend political power to buy up influence, but it's very expensive. It's like 100 for like 1%, so there's really no point. And influence helps you when it comes time to make decisions as well. So when I start making decisions on the 9-dash line and I try to enforce it, well, if I have lots of influence over, Vietnam, and the Philippines and Malaysia, they're more likely to accept my demands. They're more likely to accept the fact that I own the 9-line. If I have very little influence, well, they're less likely. And if they start, if I hold lots of influence over them and they still disobey, I can start selling my international investments in them, which will tank their economy and put them into a depression, or it might, they might have to raise tax rates, or it might massively raise their interest rates. So if they're a lot in debt, as they are to me, then it would pretty much cripple them. So there's lots of ways you can go about it.